After the contractor is out of the picture, you need to have your assignment of inventions clause.
Welcome to the Contract Teardown Show from Law Insider, where legal experts tear down contracts from some of the most well-known companies and high-profile executives around the world.
In this episode, tech company counsel Hebe Doneski tears down an independent contractor agreement from Red Lion Hotels. This agreement stands out specifically because it doesn't stand out. It's pretty typical for an engagement for work that's becoming more and more common. We talk about the assignment of inventions, use of confidential information, incorporations by reference, and big picture shifts in the nature of work. So, let's tear it down. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Contract Teardown Show. I'm Mike Whalen. The purpose of the show is to do exactly what it sounds like. We take contracts, we beat them up, we do it with smart friends like my friend Hebe over here. Hebe, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks, Mike. How are you?
Pretty good. Hebe Doneski, we are talking about a document, as we do. It is this document. It's an independent contractor agreement, and if you guys look at this, you can tell it's coming from Law Insider. So you'll see links on here to similar language, to other places. It's a really cool resource. I appreciate Hebe for finding one on here, and we're going to talk about some of this information. It's filed in an SEC 8K filing, which is where you'll find this kind of thing. So Hebe, why are we talking about this particular document? When does it come up in practice?
Well, I would say next to the non-disclosure agreement, independent contractor agreements are really kind of the lifeblood of any business. They're the most common agreement you're going to see in pretty much any kind of commercial practice. So I wanted to tear down this particular independent contractor agreement with Red Lion Hotels. And I think we'll have fun doing it.
And like NDAs, they're usually pretty crappy. So we're going to go through this thing and talk about it. Hebe, as we do, why you? Why are we talking to you? Tell me about your background, your practice, what you're doing in life.
Sure. So I started a practice recently representing tech companies as they grow, typically 0 to sort of 100 million in revenue companies that are too small to have lawyers in-house, and I help them with everything they need, including a lot of these independent contractor agreements.
Indeed. There's a whole economy being built on independent contractor agreements, which is a sort of a huge social mess, and we'll talk about that later. But first, let's get into particular language as we do. We're going to go down through these different sections. Before we get started with that, I know there was a background thing that was missing in this that smacked you upside the head. Tell me what was missing in this document just to start with and why it's driving you crazy.
Yeah, well, the thing that really jumped out at me in this is there's no assignment of inventions language. There isn't the customary work for hire clause that you would expect to see. And in the tech world where I live, that's the most important part of the agreement. The reason you sign an independent contractor agreement typically is to ensure as the company that you can do whatever you want with the deliverables that the contractor makes for you. Now, in this particular agreement, that probably isn't a huge problem because if you look at the scope of work, what the contractor is doing is primarily sort of shaking hands and kissing babies and using his network to get hotels to sign up as franchisees. But if you're in any kind of a business where a contractor is creating a deliverable for you, whether that is source code, whether it's ad copy, whether it's content, logos, any type of deliverable, and you want to be able to do what you want with that deliverable after the contractor is out of the picture, you need to have your assignment of inventions clause.
Right, and certainly even in that scope of work, you could imagine somebody coming up with a cool idea for how to do this thing better, and who owns that idea after?
Yeah, and it's the contractor as this contract's written. So that jumped out at me as a pretty glaring omission, and just kind of a parenthetical on the assignment of inventions / work for hire concept. Something I see companies miss often is if you are working with a contractor or a company who's overseas. Typically, our work for hire doctrine is really an American concept. Most countries don't recognize it, and so you can get to the same place. But in most countries, IP rights aren't assignable. So you really need to take a careful look at that particular provision if you're dealing with a contractor who is not in the US. I've even seen companies overseas that sort of grabbed a US-centric contractor agreement and it had that work for hire clause in it. And even they didn't realize it was going to be completely unenforceable where they were.
Good note. Let's go down to what is in here. We're going to jump down to number 5. Fairly long section. It's talking about by your engagement or affiliation, you're going to agree to other things. It talks about the sensitive and valuable information. There's definitions for confidential information in there, as you typically see in these kinds of agreements. But it also says that there are other certain sellers listed on the signature pages there too, as amended. The purchase agreement, it starts to reference other documents, restrictive covenants. What do you think about documents like this that are meant for this relationship? Is incorporating these other things by reference and just talking about them, is that the right way to go with this kind of document?
I think in this case, they did themselves a disservice by referencing this external document. When you pull this asset purchase agreement and you look at section 6.7, it's just a non-solicitation and non-competition covenant. It's not very long, less than a page. And so I think if I had this to do over again, I would have taken a look at that and added it maybe as an exhibit. Because what they missed, I think, was they created a potential ambiguity. So this non-solicitation and non-competition covenant was supposed to last for 3 years after the closing of this particular M&A transaction. And that 3-year period would have expired sometime towards the end of this independent contractor agreement. But what they've done, if you take a look at the last sentence of this paragraph, the provisions of this section 5 survive any termination or expiration of this agreement. So the contractor is bound by these covenants. Is he now bound forever? I think that by copying and pasting that provision into an exhibit or into the agreement, hopefully the drafter would have noticed the potential for creating that ambiguity and would have enabled them to close that gap, to not potentially cause that non-solicitation covenant now to last forever. And I didn't research Nevada law, which controls this agreement, but we all know that in most cases, the longer a non-competition clause is, the less likely it is to be enforceable. Right. So not only have they created a potential problem for the contractor here who may want to compete somewhere down the road, the company's potentially created a problem for themselves by making that non-competition covenant unenforceable by making it too long.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Whalen. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Contract Teardown Show. Real quick, I want to ask you to do me/you really a quick favor. Look down below. You'll see a discount code to join the Law Insider Premium subscription. When you do that, you get access to more content like this. You'll see webinars, daily tips on contract drafting, not to mention access to the world's largest database of sample contracts and clauses. It will help you write better contracts faster. If you want to do it right now, there's a code below, so get there. Also, if you're part of a larger team, if you're in-house or in a law firm, just email us. We're at sales@lawinsider.com. We'll make sure you get a deal as well. Come join us in the community. The code is below. Let's get back to the show. Something that they were quite expressive about, which makes me wonder about some past history, is some not being mean about the company. In 6, 7, and 8, there's language about not criticizing, denigrating, or disparaging the company or any past and present parents, subsidiaries, divisions. It goes on. It talks about 2 years following the termination. No executive or vice president can go talk mean out in the world about the contractor. And then in 8, it says a lot of language about you can say, truthful things, but here are some limits on it. But it seems like the hotel industry might have some, tattle-tally language going on in the background. What do you see in these sections?
Yeah, I wondered the same thing that you did. Was there something about the relationship? Because this is clearly a former executive who's going to work for the company as a contractor. But absent that relationship and something specific to be concerned about, these clauses have become really ubiquitous in independent contractor agreements. And I always question a client when they want to put this in. Obviously, before there was Twitter, before there was Facebook, you kind of needed access to the press or industry analysts or somebody to really meaningfully disparage a company. Now anybody can do it. So these have really, really crept in recent years. But you wonder what kind of tone does this set for the relationship when you start out assuming that this guy is going to badmouth you as the company. The other problem I have with this is it's very, very one-sided. So the contractor can't criticize the company at all. But the Section 7, where the company is not allowed to disparage the executive, what was that ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal?
Yeah.
You could drive that cargo ship through it, basically. Right. It's so loosely written. So the executive vice president or higher, or members of the board or directors, I mean, that's probably a handful of people, a dozen people. They can't authorize or permit anyone to publicly disparage this guy. So it would be very easy for them to say under their breath in a meeting, oh, gee, wouldn't it be nice if there was a negative press release that came out about that guy? And there would be nothing this guy could do about it. And arguably, sure, their reputation is more susceptible to harm than his, but I just didn't like I don't like lopsidedness in agreements generally, and I didn't like it here.
Broad on one side, narrow on the other. You tend to see that. Under 9, speaking of things ending, which is obviously good material for a contract, it talks about termination for cause. They can end the termination. They can end the engagement for cause at any time, and then it goes through a pretty long list of what cause means. Again, this one's fairly of all the sections in this document. I think this might literally be the longest. What cause means in this scenario. What do you think about this particular section?
Well, I, from a drafting perspective, it's problematic. So in all cases, if you look towards the end, about a third of the way from the end, the company can give the contractor an opportunity to cure. But then if we go back to these breaches, almost none of them are capable of cure. So he's charged with, convicted of, or pleads guilty or nolo to a crime involving moral turpitude or a felony. He engages in gross neglect or gross misconduct. He engages in theft, fraud, embezzlement, dishonesty. These things really aren't capable of cure. Right. So I would have liked to have seen something in this provision that said to the extent the breach is not capable of cure, the company can terminate immediately. This may be another one of those, again, where the parties were assuming, well, he's just not going to do any of these things, but you'd be surprised.
So you're saying there's no takebacks in theft, fraud, embezzlement, that you can't just say, never mind? You can't just say, just
never mind.
That is too bad. Jumping down to 22. A lot of times in these relationships, obviously, we're looking at the indemnification. In 22, it talks about contractor shall defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the company from any and all liability, damages, suits, and losses, including attorney's fees, etc. Company shall defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the contractor from suits, including attorney's fees, arising out of company's breach of this agreement. Again, do you feel that the nature of the relationship between these two is evenly matched in this section?
I don't. This is another one where A, it's lopsided. B, what kind of individual has enough insurance to really indemnify a company, first off? This is another clause that's become somewhat ubiquitous. My personal pet peeve is when companies now are trying to get contractors to agree to indemnify them for misclassifying the contractor. Haven't seen it litigated. Don't know if anybody out there has seen it litigated. Please call me if you have. That just seems ridiculous to me. Okay. I mean, you're the company, the burden is on you to classify the contractor properly. And if you don't, you got some nerve asking them to indemnify you for that. But in general, in this agreement, that's not present. But I just didn't like the general lopsidedness or the unrealistic sort of sense of comfort it might give a company to think that this guy does something bad, he's going to indemnify them. Be able to indemnify them without bankrupting himself.
Yeah, and that gets to sort of the big picture question behind documents like this for me, which is, all these companies are sort of building on the backs of contractors. You mentioned technology, which is certainly the case there. Me in the media space, very similar. These companies are building on the backs of contractors, and there's this desire to be contractors, but on both sides, but there's also a lot of risk there for both sides in terms of it not reflecting what their actual wishes are. Tell me your thoughts on this, overuse of the term contractor when really you don't have much of a contractor relationship. And with that, if I'm doing this drafting work, how do I make sure that A, this is what people actually want, and B, that I draft it in a way that captures that desire?
That's a great point. This agreement in particular has, I counted at least 10 sections that read like a checklist of the, criteria to classify a worker as an independent contractor. And now, parenthetical, we're not talking about California and the rideshare case and the legislation that's working its way through. In most states, you're talking about the federal standard. So this agreement reads like a nice checklist of the federal standard of things that you're not supposed to do with an independent contractor, like tell them when to work or control the place where they work or make them do things that you would make employees do. But I think it's important for companies that engage contractors to train their employees in how to engage with those contractors. So for example, if this agreement says you are going to work out of your home office and you're going to set your own hours, but the person managing this contractor says, I want your butt in your seat from 9 to 5 inside my office, right, that defeats the purpose of the agreement. So I think it's really important to train managers who are managing independent contractors in how they're supposed to behave to ensure that you're not defeating the purpose of having a contingent worker instead of an employee.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely I'm thinking of a compliance sort of component in that side of the business. Does that change the way you draft this? Meaning, if I'm writing this, knowing that the person that I want to actually read and understand it is the local manager at the hotel in, Idaho, does that change the way you draft this and you approach it in terms of readability or in terms of smacking people upside the head with, bolded headlines? Do you do anything drafting-wise differently, or do you just assign that to sort of the compliance and training side of the business?
Actually, I do like the way most of this is drafted from the perspective that the clauses are short. It is very readable. But I don't think the agreement is a substitute for training, whether it's delivered by HR, compliance, local operations. But in general, I can't criticize those provisions of the agreement because they are very readable and understandable.
Right.
It's just important that the company behaves consistently with them.
Yeah. If there's one thing I've learned seeing employment law in action, it is that your intentions are nice, but you got to make sure that whatever you write backs up whatever that intention is and protects you, because there's just stuff lurking. You can call it a contractor relationship, but if you don't behave like it, it doesn't matter. So I appreciate that perspective. Hebe, if people want to get a hold of you to talk more about agreements like this and the other kinds of agreements that you work with young technology companies in your space, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
They can find me on LinkedIn or at 108legal.com.
That's awesome. I appreciate it. And all of you watching, if you want to see this document and other resources, we're doing these robust blog posts now, including things that you can download with individual tips, 5 tips that are listed on each of those documents. You'll see that over at lawinsider.com/resources. And if you want to be a guest on this show and beat up a contract as the cool nerds do, just email us. We're at community@lawinsider.com. We'll have you on the show. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you again, Hebe. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mike.